Hey friends, Powwow Guy here. Get your copy of The Long Lost Friend ready. Get your copy of Albertus Magnus and the Romanus book line, because today I'm going to talk about those obscure illnesses that are referenced in all the old Powwow charm books. Now, it's very easy for people, skeptics mostly, to pick up a copy of The Long Lost Friend in this day and age and say, well, these illnesses are crazy. What are they talking about? What's pole evil? What's Sweeney? What's Quincy? All these weird illnesses. But really, back when these books were written, the understanding of certain conditions and such was different than it is today. So they had different names for conditions, but almost all of the charms are still relevant to this day and age. You just have to understand what they were talking about then. All right, so I have this list that I'm going to keep referencing. It's kind of alphabetical, but if you're interested in learning Powwow, in doing Powwow, in understanding what the charms in the historical materials are talking about, then you might want to take some notes here, or reference this video once in a while, just so you can understand what they were talking about when they referenced certain illnesses that seem very obscure to us, very strange. The first one I'm going to talk about is an illness called, literally pronounced ague. Ague, or ague. It's spelled A-G-U-E. So you'll see this in, especially The Long Lost Friend, a charm for ague. All right. You don't get any clue in the charm what they're talking about, but this is an old word from like the 17 and 1800s that literally meant fevers accompanied by both chills and sweats. So those were the conditions to be met for your patient or your client to be diagnosed with ague, A-G-U-E. They had to have a high fever that gave them bouts of both sweats and chills, often accompanied by shivering. So when you see a charm like a cure for ague, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about fevers with chills and sweats. Okay, pretty easy to understand. Okay, another one you might see referenced in the old Powwow source materials is something called apoplexy. All right, apoplexy is paralysis caused by a stroke. So you can see partial apoplexy, where people, like, maybe the left or right half of their body is paralyzed. But that's what apoplexy is. It's paralysis caused by a stroke. I recently had a patient come to me in need of healing for paralysis, for apoplexy. They didn't call it such, they called it paralysis, but I used the charms that were designed for apoplexy to assist them. Another thing you might come across is bad blood. There may be some charms out there, a cure for bad blood, or a relief for the bad blood, okay? Bad blood, back in the day, meant syphilis. Syphilis was a very, very serious threat back in the 17, 1800s, whatever, early 1900s. It would drive people crazy. But kind of a code word for it in these old charms, even in old medical journals, was bad blood. So keep in mind, if you ever see the words bad blood in a charm, they're talking about syphilis. Hopefully you'll never have to try for anybody with syphilis in this day and age. But if you ever come across that, that's what they were talking about. Also, we want to talk about the brain fever, okay? Brain fever was often like in children. So you would see charms for the brain fever in a child, that kind of thing. What they were talking about was meningitis, or typhus, one or the other. So typhus was a type of fever that would basically kill the brain, I guess. I'm not really sure. Meningitis is a very serious brain disorder. So, but that would be called the brain fever. Okay. Another one, which I may not pronounce correctly, is catarrh. C-A-T-A-R-R-H. There are many charms for the relief of catarrh, okay? What catarrh was an inflammation of like the mucous membranes, so it could cause bronchitis. That's generally what the charms were geared toward. Inflammation of the bronchial tubes that would cause bronchitis. So a chore for the catarrh, or a charm for the catarrh, whatever, was for bronchitis. So there you go, catarrh. Cholera, which there are still some countries that the babies die of cholera, but cholera was basically an intestinal kind of digestive disease that children get from contaminated milk products. Back then, even like powdered milk and such could be contaminated. In this day and age, it's not really a thing, but if you see cholera, like a cure for cholera in infants and such, that's what they're talking about. It was an infection that you would get from contaminated milk products. And I mean, within 3 to 5 days, the babies would be dead. Very sad. So thank God things have progressed. Another thing you're going to see charms for is something called consumption. Now, people have erroneously thought consumption meant cancer, but consumption meant tuberculosis. So if you see charms for consumption, they're talking about tuberculosis. Hopefully you'll never, ever, 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 ever need to use that in this day and age. But there you go. You see consumption, a cure for the consumption, a charm for the consumption, whatever. They're talking about tuberculosis. Another one you might see is a little more obscure, but you may still see that in some. I feel like I've seen it in a few charms. That's why I want to mention it. It's something called corruption. So you might see like for corruption in the lungs, for corruption in the bowels, for corruption in the skin. The word corruption was used for infection. Okay? So if you see that word corruption in a charm, it's referencing an infection of some sort. So if your client has an infection in their lungs or whatever, you can use a charm that references the word corruption, because that's what that's addressing. Interesting, right? Yeah, so all these like old sort of words and understandings. Here's a really good one. Dropsy. Okay? Dropsy was a little hard to pinpoint, but essentially dropsy was when people would retain fluid and their bodies would swell with this fluid. They become bloated due to either like a kidney infection or congestive heart failure. So you would see their bodies swell, look like put all this like water weight. They were retaining fluids because of this. And you can sometimes see that in people who are retaining fluid, like their socks look like they're too tight. They take their socks off and it leaves this dark ring around their ankles or their shins because their ankles and feet and legs swell up. That's dropsy. All right, that's people still do that. They're retaining fluid for whatever reason, usually a sign of kidney disease or congestive heart failure. So if you see a charm that uses the word dropsy in it, it's addressing that particular situation. Next one I want to talk about, this was huge. There are a lot of charms for this. But this was back in the day when people were baking their own breads, growing their own wheat and rye. They would get compromised by this bacteria, this fungus bacteria, and it would do what's called ergot poisoning. So it would cause this painful burning skin condition called erysipelas. So you're going to see a lot of charms for erysipelas, and this was just basically compromised rye or wheat that they would bake their food out of, and it would give them this infection. It would cause hallucinations, this burning skin disorder. The technical word was erysipelas. Sometimes it was referred to as St. Anthony's fire. So there are many charms out there that reference either St. Anthony or dragon red. What they're talking about is erysipelas. And this is this like burning skin infection caused by ergotism, or, ergot poisoning, rye poisoning, wheat poisoning. So a lot of things have codes. One of the codes for erysipelas was the word rose. So you may see some of the old powwow charms referencing roses. 3 roses grew on Christ's grave and such. It's highly likely that these are charms for erysipelas, because that's another word for the disease, was rose, or dragon's red, or the dragon, or St. Anthony. So watch for all of that. You can now use those charms for shingles, because it was very much like shingles, painful, red, burning, terrible. But erysipelas was more like all over your body, whereas shingles is kind of limited, so it's sort of 1/2 of your body. But you see those charms that reference roses, St. Anthony, dragons, or erysipelas. You can use those for shingles as well, or even like chickenpox. Obviously, they're all related. Another one you might come across is a charm or a cure for the falling sickness. The falling sickness is epilepsy. It makes sense. When they get a seizure, people fall. So you see a charm or cure for the falling sickness, they're talking about epilepsy. So here you go. What else do I have here? Oh, gravel. There are many charms for the gravel. What they're actually talking about when they say gravel is kidney stones. People still get kidney stones. Now our diets, I believe, are much better than they were back in the day. But still, unhealthy diets and such can result in kidney stones. So if you see charms and cures in any of our Powwow resource materials for the gravel, that's what they're talking about. So use that. I want to honorable mention here is inflammation. Now, back in the day, inflammation was a very serious diagnosis. So in order to meet that diagnosis of inflammation, there had to be 4 criteria met, okay? There had to be swelling, which nowadays we think it's swollen, it's inflamed. But back then, it had to be swollen, all right? It had to give off heat, hot to the touch. The skin had to be hot to the touch. It had to be red in color. It was like an angry, swollen, hot, red thing, and the patient had to be experiencing pain. So all 4 of those elements, they would diagnose as inflammation. And you can see, like in modern times, well, not even modern times, but we look at these old charms for inflammation, they reference the color red. They reference heat. They reference sweating and swelling. So inflammation is interesting because those charms generally always reference like the color red and all that, the heat, the sweating, and the swelling. Just so you kind of know where that comes from. Let's talk about liver grown. You'll see that a lot. There are a lot of charms for liver grown. I don't know if that was common back then, but liver grown literally means an enlarged liver. So whether it was liver disease or cirrhosis of the liver or alcoholism, we can't really say. But if someone was liver grown, it means they had an enlarged liver. So if you're trying for someone who has any kind of liver issues, look for those cure for liver grown, and that's what you can use. Lung fever, you might see an old charm for the lung fever, that's pneumonia. All right, whereas the lung sickness would be consumption, otherwise known as tuberculosis. So lung fever is pneumonia, lung sickness is tuberculosis. All right, let's see. Another one you're going to see a lot of charms for is palsy. All right, palsy is kind of a broad term, but it's basically any charms for palsy or the palsy will work for any uncontrollable shaking or paralysis caused by illness. So you have like cerebral palsy, or you have paralysis caused by stroke, or you have, Bell's palsy or whatever. So any kind of uncontrollable shaking, like Parkinson's disease, or bouts of paralysis caused by an illness. You want to use those charms for palsy. All right, they're very generalized for all of those situations. Here's an interesting one. There are a few charms out there for the pole evil in horses. The pole evil in horses is actually a condition, and I believe they still use the words pole evil today. It's basically a sort of inflammation that horses get at the base of their skull. And it spreads and it inflames their head. Very painful for the horses, awful. But it's still called pole evil. So if you see the charms for that, that's what that's for. If you work with horses, you might be more familiar with it than I am. Another thing there are charms for, and a lot of these charms use the context of God speaking to either Moses or various saints where they're unhappy and they're expressing their grievances with God in the charms. They have something called a putrid mouth or a putrid throat. What they're actually talking about is ulcers or abscesses. Like ulcers in the mouth can be very painful. I know my son, and when I was a little boy, and my son as a young boy, gets a lot of ulcers in his mouth. And I used to too, like if I'd eat a potato chip or something, I'd get all these ulcers in my mouth, terrible. But also ulcers in the throat that would cause like tonsillitis and stuff. So you have like a terrible sore throat, or you have this like awful sore mouth because of ulcers. That's considered putrid. So you want to look for those charms that talk about for a putrid mouth or for a putrid throat. That's what we're talking about, ulcers and abscesses. All right, serious stuff, terrible stuff, but that's what you use those charms for. Another one that has a lot of charms for it is something called Sweeney. All right, that's actually the atrophy of muscles in horses. It's not a human condition at all. It's a horse condition. And you can understand why horses were so important to the Pennsylvania Germans back in the day. It was like the transportation and the workforce and whatever else. So yeah, you see a charm for Sweeney. That's if you have a horse with any kind of muscular atrophy, you're going to use those charms that are for Sweeney. Okay, kind of interesting. Finally, I want to wrap this up with the charms that are for worms. Now, there are several charms for worms, and some of them call on colors, either white, black, red, white, brown, or red. The colors aren't that important, but it's important to note that when they're talking about worms, they're talking about one of three things. Cancer, because back in those days, cancer was considered like a parasite, like a worm, or some sort of like devil or dragon got into your body. This worm got in there and was like eating away at you. Bacteria, which was not understood back then, so it was thought to be worms, or actual parasites in animals or people. So the charms for worms, you have to figure out, is this one's for cancer? Is this one for bacteria? Is this one for actual parasites? And use those accordingly. But that's what the worms charms are, okay? Cancer, bacteria, or parasites. So that's it. Those are some of the most common, like, obscure words for illnesses that you'll find in the old Powwow books. Keep this information handy because, people say, oh, this stuff is nonsense. What are they even talking about in these books? But they're actually still relevant to this day and age. And as long as you know which charms are most appropriate for which conditions, you're in good hands. You should be all right. So that's my video today. I hope you learned a lot with this. Please keep this video handy. I hope you took notes because it's really important. And if you ever have any questions, just reach out to me. Please go to pagermanpowwow.com. Reach out to me, ask me questions, send me an email, text me, whatever. It's all on there on the main page. And that's it. So I hope you guys have a great night. Love you guys very much. God bless you, and we'll talk soon.